the Chinese language. So do you have an example? I mean, ma is kind of the typical one way of ma, ma.
Yeah, ma is like horse, and then if you like ma, it's like mom.
So can you say them more clearly? So there are 4 tones. So we have.
So there's so first tone ma, 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 and then there's like a 5th tone, which is like no emphasis at all, which is just ma.
Okay. So, and of course, to our ears, when we're not used to that, that sounds really quite challenging. Okay. So people like to tell me how difficult English is, and English is difficult, but so are other languages too. And I've had people tell me, oh, I've heard English is the most difficult language in the world. It's kind of a crazy statement to make. Of course, there are complex things about English, and there are easier things about languages like Mandarin, but there are also complex things with Mandarin too, like the tonal system. Okay, we're not used to that. So if someone says ma and ma, that's kind of hard to distinguish for us, right? But so it's easier in some ways, but complex in other ways. Okay, so languages have complex. I mean, the term complex and simple, of course, are kind of subjective anyway. But there are what you might consider to be difficult, more difficult things to acquire, and easier things to acquire. So the Sino-Tibetan languages are tonal languages. They don't have a distinction between he and she. So the pronoun for he and she is just ta. So ta, she, he is, or she is, or it is, there's no difference. Okay, so some languages of the world just don't make that distinction. Okay, we're used to having that distinction between he and she, but some languages just don't make that distinction. They have little morphology, and what I mean by this is, so you say I talk, and then to say he talks, what you do is you add an S, okay, and that S makes it the 3rd person. And of course, different languages do this in different ways. English is quite simple in terms of morphology, because essentially we only add an S for the present tense 3rd person, but other languages have a different ending for all different forms. A language like Mandarin doesn't have any what's called inflectional morphology. So where we would have an S in English to say he talks, they would just say he talk, and I talk, and we talk, and there's no I talked or I will talk. Okay, so when I said I talk, we added ed to make it a past tense. In a language like Mandarin, they wouldn't do that, but they can still convey the same idea. They just do that contextually. So you would say something like, "Yesterday I talked to James," and of course that makes sense. Really, it's kind of superfluous that we have to use the morphology anyway. How useful is that S when you say he talks? Because the idea is communicating. Right? He talked right now. It's obvious what I'm saying. Of course, you think, well, no, it's he talks. But how useful is that S, really? We know who's doing the talking because I said he, right? So it's a little bit superfluous. And some languages just don't have this. Moving to Japonic. So this is Japanese. Japanese is a little bit strange in that we don't really know which languages are related. The same with languages like Korean. Some people try to put them in a big language family, but there's not much evidence to say that they really are truly linguistically related. A language like Japanese is interesting because it has what's called a CV structure. C stands for consonant, B stands for vowel. So they typically, in every word, with a few exceptions, they have a consonant and vowel. Consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel. In English, we can have lots of consonants together. You take a word like street, you have sir, you have t, and you have w. And that's what's called a consonant cluster. So a language like English allows lots of consonants to be together, to be next to each other. But a language like Japanese doesn't allow that. Okay? So especially if Japanese borrows a word from a language which doesn't follow that structure, they have to change it a little bit. Okay? And especially, kind of stereotypically, if you hear Japanese speakers, native speakers trying to speak English, and if they don't speak very well, then they'll put vowels on the end of words that are not there. And that's because they're just following this system. They can't just have a consonant, they have to have a vowel. Okay. Who are our Japanese speakers? Do you have an example of perhaps an experience where you've heard a Japanese speaker trying to speak English and they put an O or A on the end of a word? So, for example, James O, because they just can't end it in.
Oh, I guess my name. My name is Liz, and so they'll say Lizu. So they'll go after my name instead of just stopping the Z. They don't have like a just straight Z sound. It's Z.
Okay, and then and that oo is also a vowel as well. So they're adding a vowel because it's what they're used to. Okay, when we talk about phonology, we'll get into this, but different languages have different phonotactics, and I defined that, I believe, on day one. Those are sounds which can touch, and a language like Japanese only allow consonant vowel. Okay, and if you violate that, you would have to change it. Okay, it just doesn't make sense. Okay. There are lots of interesting things about Japanese. So yeah, they don't allow consonant clusters. So if they were to take a word like street, and they had to borrow that from English, they would have to add a vowel between each consonant. So something like s, t, something.
Like a lot of times for like state names, like those pronounced differently, like New York would be like New Yorku. Like they have the Q at the end, not just like with the K.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to try and give an example, but I don't speak Japanese, but I believe the word for girlfriend in Japanese is borrowed from English, and it's something like giru, firendu, obviously terrible pronunciation, but they're adding vowels in there because they just can't, it's just unnormal, it's unnatural for them to say something like girlfriend, so th and r next to each other just doesn't work. Okay. With regard to their writing system, that's really interesting because they combine 3 different writing systems, and we'll get into this one towards the end of the semester when we talk about writing systems. And also Japanese does not have a phonemic distinction between r and l. In other words, in their language, they're almost like variations of the same sound. In the same way that you could say a writer, someone who writes, and in British English you would say writer, so it becomes a global stop. And in the same way that that's kind of a variation, so we're still saying the same thing, in Japanese, a sound like r and l, for them are kind of just variations of the same sound. They don't kind of register them as different sounds. Okay? So kind of an interesting development here is, we all know ramen noodles, right? You go to Walmart, you don't have much money, and you buy some ramen noodles. So ramen actually is borrowed from, well, originally goes back to Mandarin, which is something like ramen. Again, there's a tone in there, I'm not good with the tones. But Japanese borrowed the word ramen, and of course they can't produce an L so well, so it's produced with a R. And then we borrow the word ramen from Japanese. That's why we get the word ramen in English and not ramen. Okay? Good. And this down here, so people are not really sure as to which languages could be related to Japanese and Korean, but there is a hypothesis, it's called the Altaic hypothesis, and they also include Turkic languages in this too, and they try to lump these together and say that historically they're related, but this is a hypothesis and there's not much, I don't want to say there's not much evidence, not many people believe it so far. Okay, so maybe things will change in 20 years. But, it's not the general consensus that it is true. Okay, so now moving south a little bit, we have the Austronesian languages. So up here where we have Indonesia, okay, New Guinea. These are really, really interesting languages because there's not much, when you think of a place like Europe, we have lots and lots of countries. There are not that many countries there, yet there are so many languages spoken there. Okay, so even just on the island of New Guinea, there are approximately 800 languages spoken on one island. And I believe the reason why people hypothesize that to be the case is there are lots of mountains there. And if you have physical boundaries, that's going to create linguistic boundaries, right? Because people are not communicating with each other, so the language doesn't change, or it changes, but it doesn't change as a result of language contact, because there isn't much contact. So there are approximately 1,200 Austronesian languages. A few of these you may have heard of, so Indonesian. Javanese, not Japanese, so with a V. Malay, Samoan, Maori, and Hawaiian. Okay? And then we have a language which is an Austronesian language, but it's spoken in Madagascar. So you know Africa, and then you have Madagascar. So what's interesting about that is it's an Austronesian language, but how did they get there? So the people obviously started from over here, and they had to somehow get to Madagascar. So how did they get there? So they obviously took a boat, and they survived somehow. It's kind of remarkable if you look at the distance, how on earth they did that. Clearly they did it because we have a population there of an Austronesian language, and there's a whole civilization. So, I mean, people are speaking an Austronesian language there, yet it's so far away, and well, you can't walk there, right? So there's an ocean there. So how did they get there? They must have traveled by sea, and it's such a huge distance, and it's quite remarkable to think that they made it, and there are lots of speakers there. So that's an Austronesian language family, and then we have the Austroasiatic languages. Many of these are spoken in Australia. Okay, so if you think of the kind of indigenous languages of Australia, so I have a fact down here. It's kind of sad, really. So there are approximately 270 languages spoken in Australia. Of course, when we think of Australia from our perspective, we think, oh, everyone speaks English, and of course, most people do speak English, but then they still have other languages spoken there. But of course, they don't have much political power, so no one really cares about them. And what's scary is there are roughly 270 languages spoken in Australia, and many of which are endangered, which means they'll soon die out, and because they don't have many speakers left. Okay, so of these 270 languages are spoken by about 30,000 natives, okay, which is nothing. That means, you know, in our lifetime, well, maybe not in our lifetime, 100, 200 years from now, those languages could be gone. Okay, and there's a lot of work done on language endangerment and trying to revive languages, and we'll also talk about that towards the end of this semester. Okay. So, questions so far? Okay, so now we've spoken about several major language families, and now I want to get to the one that we're perhaps most interested in based on the languages that we're learning, and one that we're actually more familiar with. Okay, linguists know more about Indo-European than they know about any other language family. So there's a lot of work that's gone into Indo-European. So Indo-European is a language family that is spoken, well, originally was spoken somewhere. So one language, think of it as one language, which has developed into lots of languages, which originally was spoken somewhere in the geographical region of India and Europe. And what we know about the Indo-Europeans, these people about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, is that they had horses and they had the wheel, right? And as a result of that, they were able to travel, they were able to migrate, and therefore they brought their language with them, and throughout time the languages developed into different languages. Okay, so what is one original language, one language which is called Indo-European, develops into different dialects, which eventually develops into different languages. Okay. Most of the languages that we're all studying, with the exception of languages like Japanese, are Indo-European languages. Okay. And hopefully, we can go through a couple of these today, and maybe you'll be surprised how is Russian related to English. It is. It's an Indo-European language. So this stretches from India to West Europe, and it is the largest language family in the world based on numbers of speakers, okay? Not based on number of languages. I mean, think of Austronesian, the amount of languages spoken there, but based on the number of speakers today, Indo-European is the largest language family. So yet they had horses, they had wheels, and they liked to travel, and therefore the language came with them when they traveled, and of course they developed into different languages. And people differ as to how many branches of Indo-European there are, but people roughly say there are about 9 different branches. But this is kind of a depiction of this. So you can think of it, when we talk about language genealogy, it's in the same way that we talk about language not language, but just families, right? So you have your grandparents, and then you have your parents, and then you have you, and your kids, and their kids. So you can kind of draw a genealogical tree, and we can do that for language. I suppose usually we're used to seeing it the other way around, but this would be the start. Okay, so we have Indo-European, and then it diverges into different branches. So we have the European languages, and we have the Indo-Iranian languages. To move over to Indo-European languages, then it branches up into different branches, such as Germanic, Romance, so Latin, Slavic, which would be the Russian languages, and then of course they further divide. Okay. So we have Romance, Celtic, Balto-Slavic, Hellenic, Albanian, Armenian, Indo-Iranian, Tocharian, which died out a long time ago, and Germanic. Okay. So Romance, we talked about this before, language of the Romans, which was Latin, and then it developed into the languages that we have today, such as Spanish, French, Italian, Catalan, and Galician. Then we have the Celtic languages, and when I say languages, I really mean sub-language family, right? They're all Indo-European languages, but they can be divided into subfamilies. Okay, so the subfamily Celtic gives rise to Irish Gaelic and Scottish Gaelic. Americans don't make a distinction between, we'll just say Gaelic, I believe, or Gaelic. But if you ask an Irish person what language they speak other than English, they'll say Gaelic, and if you ask a Scottish person, they'll say Gaelic. If you get it wrong, we'll get it. Okay, so in the US, I've heard professors just use the same pronunciation for both. Irish and Scottish people will get a little bit angry. So just so you know, so we have Gaelic and we have Gaelic, and then we have languages like Welsh, Cornish, and Manx. Okay, and some of these have either died out, but we've revived them. So there's just a great deal of effort that is involved in trying to. Whenever a language is not passed on to a new generation, that's a dangerous point for the language. So if you speak English and all the speakers of English have kids, but they don't speak English to their kids natively, that's kind of the first stage of language engagement, right? Because then maybe they'll learn it as a second language, but not so natively, and then they're not going to pass it on to their kids, and a few generations down it's going to be gone. Okay? So there's been a lot of effort to kind of revive languages. Hebrew is kind of a huge success, but many languages have not been a success. If you go to Wales, I think someone said that they went to Wales. Yeah, and you'll see that the signs are in English and in Welsh. And this kind of, if you ask a Welsh person, do they speak Welsh, they'll say yes. But they don't really speak it as a native, right? They kind of learn it at school, and they'll say that they speak it, and I'm sure they can say, they can get by, but not many people just speak Welsh as their native language. So Welsh is at the point where it soon probably won't die out because we have it in written form, and there's this kind of huge effort to teach it to people, but they're learning it as a foreign language. So no one's really, other than a small population, are really speaking Welsh natively. Okay? And then that's kind of dangerous for the language for the future. Yeah.
Isn't Irish Gaelic kind of heading in the same direction?
Yeah. Yeah, most of the Celtic languages are kind of close to death, but people are really trying to. Of course, when you ask someone, they'll say no, but from a linguistic standpoint, most of the Celtic languages are done. Okay, so then we have the Balto-Slavic languages. So we have the Baltic languages, and then we have the Slavic languages like Russian and Ukrainian. Hellenic, so the Greek languages, well today was just Greek, and show different dialects of Greek. And then a couple of other ones which we won't talk about, Albanian, Armenian, Tocharian. Some of these are so old that we know so little about them, but we know that they existed. But then we have the Indo-Iranian languages, and this is kind of the crazy thing. Sanskrit, Hindu, Urdu, Bengali, Gujarati, Punjabi, all these are related to English. Okay, kind of not directly, but if you go back far enough, you'll see that they all come from Indo-European. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit today about why does a language like Sanskrit look so different to English? Okay, how does language change so much that you would think these things are not related in any way? And then of course we have Germanic, which I'll talk a little bit about in more detail. So Germanic can be divided into North Germanic, East Germanic, and West Germanic, and these are kind of geographically defined. So we have the North Germanic languages, the Scandinavian languages. You can kind of think of the northern part. So Germany's down here, we have Denmark, and here up north we have the Scandinavian languages. So Norwegian, Swedish. Then we have East Germanic. East Germanic died out a long, long time ago. But it is attested, so we do have information on that. We have a Bible translation. We know it existed, and we can tell by looking at a language like Gothic and comparing it to English and German that it existed and how they were related. But East Germanic died out a long time ago. Gothic is the first attested Germanic language that we have, so perhaps it's probably the oldest. And then we have the West Germanic languages, so if you move kind of west a little bit, such as English, German, Dutch, and Frisian. Okay. So, down here I have, why is English a Germanic language? Because English has borrowed so many words from French. Kind of any formal word is borrowed from French, which goes back to Latin. Historically, of course, English is a Germanic language, but because it's borrowed so many words from French because of language contacts, we have after 1066 we had the Normans in Britain for about 500 years, so therefore we have lots of French influence. It almost doesn't look like a Germanic language, but it is. So they share lots of cognates. This is kind of the traditional story. Some people are kind of saying it's not so true these days, but there's some truth in it at least, but it's probably a little bit more complex than this. So how do we get from a language like German or Germanic to a language like English? Well, this is kind of Germany over here, and we have Denmark. And apparently, 3 Germanic tribes came to Britain, and those were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jews. And the Angles called their land the Anglo-land, which is where we get the word England from, through various sound changes, and English, right? And of course, when Anglo today means English speaking, right? The Anglosphere, Anglo as a prefix, or prefixoid, means English speaking. And of course, Anglo-Saxon as well. The Jutes, not the Jews, a lot of people use the Jews, not the Jews, but the Jutes from Jutland. They were not so successful in terms of settling, so therefore that's where we get the Anglo and Saxon referring to English, and we never really hear anything about the Jews. So, because of this, so they travelled over and they settled. So prior to this, we had Celtic spoken in Britain, and then as a result of this kind of settlement, then we have Germanic. And therefore, languages like English and German share lots of cognates. Okay? So what is a cognate, or word cognates? Cognates are words which can be traced back to the same ancestral point. Okay, so if you take the word knee in English, is cognate with the German word knie, right? And you can see that. Auge and eye are related. Okay, so cognates are words which go back to the same. You can trace it back and say, oh, this is the same word, but it's just evolved so much that maybe they don't look like the same thing. So some of the words do look similar, others do not. So some of these look very similar. So we have English here and we have German here. So English, knee, and German knie. And of course the reason why we spell it with a K in English because it used to be pronounced as a K, and that's why it's still pronounced as a K in German. But we kept the spelling, but we no longer pronounce the K. Some of these are so obvious. Arm, English arm, German arm. Pronunciation is almost identical. Some which you can look at and be like, yep, they're related, but maybe not if I didn't show you them side by side. So stretch and strecken, pipe and pfeife, chin and kin, church and kirche, and timber, so like the wood, and that's related to the German word Zimmer, which means room. So some of these look so obvious that, I wouldn't even have to point out that they're cognates. But other words don't look so obvious because they've gone through various sound changes. So here I have a sentence in English, a sentence in German, and a sentence in Dutch. And you can see the similarity. So I have a house, an apple, and speak English. In German, ich habe, and look how close it is, ein Haus, einen Apfel und spreche English. And then of course we have Dutch, which I don't speak, but you can see the similarity. So when you put these side by side, you really kind of say, oh yeah, originally they were just dialects of the same language, but they've evolved. Okay? So you can see that they share lots of components. Okay, so how do we get from a language like Indo-European to all these different languages, and why does a language like English look so different to a language like Spanish, Russian, and other Indo-European languages? Well, one thing that we found out about 200 years ago is that there was a sound shift. In other words, various sounds in given languages changed. And they didn't change randomly, they changed in a very predictable, systematic fashion. And this is called the first Germanic sound shift, because there's a second which we won't talk about, but the first Germanic sound shift. And it's also called Grimm's Law, as in Jacob or Jakob Grimm, known for the fairy tales. He was also a famous linguist. Okay, so it's also called Grimm's Law. And what Grimm and other people worked out is that these sounds, which are called stops, stop consonants, which will make more sense when we talk about phonetics and phonology, but these sounds changed in Germanic languages, but they didn't change in all other Indo-European languages. So p becomes th, t becomes th. This is the incidental fricative, the th sound is just a fancy symbol for it. So th, think, thought, and then k becomes ch. This is close to h. Languages like Spanish have ch, and so does German. Okay, so at the kind of the next sound change would be h. You can kind of think of this as almost h. And we can see this if we take words that obviously existed a few thousand years ago. So if we take the word father in English, we have Latin pater, Spanish padre, our French speaker.
Well, is this modern French? Or?
Yeah, so how do you say father in or dad? Using the P, of course.
So that'd be père.
Yeah, okay, so we have the P. Pater in Greek and Pitar in Sanskrit, and of course, so p changes to f in Germanic languages. That's how we have father in English. In German, you have Vater. We spell it with a V, but it's just how they represent it. It's still an F. And Vadir in Gothic, that was the oldest or earliest tested Germanic language. We take this further with a different word like foot. Okay, we have Latin pes. In Spanish and French.
Well, that would actually be pied, which you have underneath. And fish would be poisson.
No, so okay. How do we say foot in French?
Pied.
Pied. Okay, so almost the same in Spanish. Podi in Greek, pada in Sanskrit. Of course, per becomes first. So we have foot in English, fuß in German, photos in Gothic. Okay, so you can see how systematic it is. You take a word that existed 2,000, 3,000 years ago, of course a word like computer wouldn't exist, but if you take something simple like foot and father, this works. Okay. Another example, so fish, we have, today this would be Pisces, of course it wasn't pronounced Pisces then, pet, so pet, and then we have
Poisson.
Okay. That's not the word?
No, fish in French is poisson. Pied is
I got them mixed up.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not sure what the Greek and Sanskrit are, but I can guarantee that they start with a P, and of course they change to in Germanic languages. So it's very systematic, it's very predictable. When people work this out, it was like, oh my gosh, all these languages are related. Okay, and people who learned lots of languages did not think initially that they were related in any way, but then they started to notice some similarities, and then they started to work this out systematically. So per becomes fer, t becomes th, so like th in English. So we have a word like three, so we have tres, and then we have three in English. In German, that originally was something like drei, but eventually it has another sound change, so we have drei and thria in Gothic. And then we have k, which becomes ch, and eventually in English it becomes h. So we have Latin cordis. Think of like cardio and all those sorts of words that we borrow. Corazon in Spanish, and of course, because in all the Germanic languages we have a H-looking sound. Okay, so heart and Herz and Heitel. Okay, it's quite impressive when you see how closely related these are and how it works. Right, it's amazing that you can just take these words and on first inspection they look so different. Yet you can predict these sound changes based on this. Okay, so I have a little activity for you. So I have, on this exercise, there are words in languages like Latin and other Indo-European languages. And you have to work out what the Germanic language form is. I have enough for everyone, but just need a little. just to show you what you need to do. So, work out the form in Germanic languages, so these here, based on the other Indo-European languages. So you have a word like nipples, and you have to work out what was that in Italian. So you're only missing one sound. Okay, and what did that become in Germanic languages? Okay, and then we have other ones, and there's a little bit of extra stuff. Okay, so it's a good idea to work with someone, and you can ask me any questions you want. And this makes it easier down here to remember this. You understand?
Yellow or blue?
So, when you look at these words here, so we have Latin, Italian, Gothic. So, we have the per sound here, and per becomes per in Germanic languages. These are Germanic languages. So, what's going to happen in the sound? What notes they?
I don't know what the word sound like.
Nipples, look at the, so it starts
Yeah.
assuming nipples.
Yeah.
And sometimes the spelling is a little bit different in the languages, but we're really interested in this.
Or nifte.
Yeah, and then so in Gothic we call it
I don't know.
nipple.
I don't know if I'm even doing this right.
You don't need to know arcade for this exercise, but Gothic is
Just
German.
yeah,
But when? In German?
Gothic is like this.
Proto-German.
Before.
Yeah, so
You think it's like nefo?
So yeah, so they kind of divide it here.
Oh,
This
wow.
is really closely related to meanings, and then the sound. So it's kind of cheap. It's like a German.
Is it nefo?
that's my guess. Nipple and nippe, probably.
Latin is like,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is going to, I assume nephews.
Yeah, and you can just use that symbol. You can write your names. The spelling doesn't matter so much as the pronunciation.
it's like tea.
Yeah, that is tea.
What's the thing?
No, Romance time. So you can kind of
So
divide.
that's like blue then? Like,
These are Germanic.
Yeah,
These
for
are
Or is it
two,
two?
and then THU. And I assume that's,
that's a long
actually that might be Z. Which would go to E in
So-
Polish.
Gothic is Germanic.
And then U.
Yeah, what is how you're calculating this? Oh, you're going nephew. Oh,
Yeah, that's my guess. Well, this is the modern.
You.
Yeah.
And this is three,
Yeah.
and not you?
Well, for one.
And at the end of the sheet here,
U.
if you can try to work out what the English word is, probably by then you will be able to work out what it is. All the old English words.
Kind of doing
Oh my gosh.
I'm getting that because again I know
Yeah, you can just write it as a H.
which it helps a lot to pick up the English ones.
So does the kind of C fall the same as the?
Ah, yes, I probably should mention that. Yeah, spelling, of course, is a disaster because when we spell something, we don't always mean the same thing with the sound. But the C here is a K. Okay, it doesn't mean so, like it does in English. So wherever it has a C here, it means.
So
What?
Yes.
You know principle.
Yeah.
Order.
You speak Italian?
Yep. Is it full and full?
Leno?
Yeah, I don't get the two.
I'm not gonna give it out, but
But it's, yeah, so this is twice as long as 2 letters.
yeah, I know this game as well.
so it's two and then it stays just two because of the hard T Italian.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then, but in Gothic, this is where shit happens.
Oh.
Yeah, you're right. There's also Leno as well, but there is a word like
Yeah,
use it
two here.
today. I don't know.
Which is split off.
And that's how we get the word.
Hydro. So it goes do in German, do.
Oh, it came on T.
So wait, so that's so what's up? What is this sound? So you think this is
And that's
So natural.
He goes like,
Oh,
and then Nick.
Oh, you, okay, I see what you have.
Oh, that's actually also, yeah, so it'd probably be around today.
I'm guessing this is,
Nick looks like you.
yeah.
And then take
You put pounds.
Kanye says like, isn't it
Okay. I'm using this fancy little beat.
100? This is 100. Yeah. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, perfect.
What was this last word?
Sounds perfect.
What language? Speak English or?
Yeah.
What's a dentist? The word dentist is to do with teeth. Yeah, so even if you don't speak Romance language, we borrowed words from Romance language. That's why we get like dentist. Yeah. Would anyone like me to take a look?
The entire.
Oh, there goes, yeah.
Okay.
German English.
What meaning is? What does this look like? And of course we spell it with H, but it's still
Yeah.
spelling always deceives us.
I don't know, lobby is what.
This is related to versus hound in English. And what is a hound? It's a dog. So we know that the English is
This is tricky.
produces words.
And that one.
No, so we know that in English that fur became so the N
Oh yeah, tooth is
and
weird.
you have fur, you
That's
have
not.
neck,
That's not.
it's neck.
That's why it's so.
And this would be an old English word. It's no longer a word that exists anymore, but if you say Shakespeare or
The TH goes towards that sound, or a TS
Okay.
sound, so it's a, in what I see as the second German language shift, the consonant shift, because.
perfect. And then if you have a bit of extra time,
Has sound.
Is this last one from?
yeah, pretty much. I'm going to go through it.
It sounds almost like English Z.
Really?
It's a bit of a struggle.
Okay, so
But it's like a T in front of it.
so
Which goes.
yeah, you got the answers though. So what do you think this is? It's nephew. Obviously there are further sound changes. Nephew. And then this is an old English word that no longer exists.
And then in modern German, see, this is a, it's a
Of
double.
course, we've replaced it now with you, so
Yeah.
but you have to go back far enough. What does this look like? What does that remind you of? Canine. What's a canine? A dog. Yeah. So this would actually be H. The German word for so in English it would have hound. Hound in English is a specific type of dog, but it's again, these are going to be H. And this would be clear.
Dumb.
That sounds like an English word. Okay, what is a century? How many? 100. Yeah, so you can see the relationship to
This is
that.
like
Century. Okay. Well,
And this would be. So the German languages, where they comes from.
I'd rip them off.
Okay, so let's run through this together.
Basically means that they're worthless.
Okay, so let's just quickly run through the answers here. So remember, we could draw a line here and say that on this side, these are Germanic languages, and these are other Indo-European languages. They're all Indo-European languages, but these are Germanic and these are non-Germanic. And what we know is that per becomes fur in Germanic languages, so we can put a fur here and a fur here. That is the English word nephew. Okay, of course we spell it differently, but forget about the spelling. Then, so this is going to be a P, okay, so it's a change. Tu, Italian, tu. So T becomes TH, so tu, Originally in German it was du, eventually it becomes du, and then in English we have a word that doesn't exist anymore, but you know it from poetry and Shakespeare. Thee, thou, all those related words. So thou shall, which meant you. We don't use it anymore. We just replaced it with you. So that's the relationship between a word, Spanish word tu and an English word thou. Then we have canis, also with a C or a K, and this becomes a H or the X in Germanic languages. So Hund, the German word for dog is Hund, and then of course we have hound, which is a specific type of dog, but it's stubborn. Yeah.
I just have a random question. So I'm assuming English had a formal and informal you, and
Yeah.
so which is which? You know?
Thou is, yeah, it's really interesting. Thou is actually informal, yet what's funny is today when people try to sound fancy, they use thou as if it's formal. But thou was actually the informal, just like in Spanish you have tu, in German you have du.
That's why I was curious, because it was the informal. I was like, well, why would that be okay? So that
Yeah, it's interesting how things have developed because people look at the past and think, oh, we had that in the past, so that sounds fancy, when actually that was the
I think I remember learning at one point that thee and thou were different by terms of like addressing multiple people versus singular, and I can see how that ties into like if you're addressing like nobility or something, the royal we or something like that. I'm just wondering, do you know which one of those?
So you're right in what you're saying, there was a difference in terms of address, but thee is actually the object form of thou. So in a language like German, you have a nominative, which is du, and then you have an accusative, which is dich. In English, you would have thou, which is thou shall, and thee would be the object of a verb. So I see thee, which is different to thou. Yeah. Yeah.
What was the formal word used in?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. Yeah, you is kind of very strange. It developed, I believe, in Middle English as ye, and then just kind of takes over. Yeah. Okay, just want to run through this. We only have a couple of minutes left. Moving down to here. Hair, in Spanish we have por vara. Please pronounce this beautiful French word
It's for.
pour. And then of course in German we have pour, which we spell with an F. And then we have for in English. Plenos, pleno, blanc. Fall in German we spell with a V. We don't worry about spelling. It's just really about the sound. So F, fall, and English full. And if you had time to get to the bottom of it, don't worry if you don't. This change is kind of a little bit like dominoes. Everyone knows what dominoes are. When you hit one domino, it hits something else and hits something else. It's called a change shift. Okay, one change affects another change and catalyzes another change. So what happened is because these sounds, because per, t, and k became f, became per. Because those change, so we no longer have them in Germanic. Now we have a problem where, well, we want to say per, but we don't have it. So what happened is originally these per, de, and g change as well. Okay? And then eventually then we have a problem where, oh, now we need these sounds, then there's another sound change. So this explains why we have a word like labio in Spanish, but that p is a p in English. So lip and lippen. This explains why in most of the European languages the word for 10 starts with a D, but in English it starts with a T. And this explains why in non-Germanic languages, but in the European languages, the word for 2 starts with a D, but in English it starts with a T. And sometimes in English we have both because we borrowed it from French. So we have the Germanic word 2, but then we have the word like dentist, which we borrowed from French. And the word for 10, we have 10. We also have words like decade and decathlon, which all represent 10. Okay? So that's everything for today. Check out the reading for Monday and have a great weekend.